Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on emerging doctrine and the Army's vision of warfare. Hello, I'm Captain Wyatt Harper, and today's podcast topic covers Reconstitution operations. With me today is the Commanding General of the Combined Arms Support Command, or CASCOM, the Sustainment Center of Excellence in Fort Lee, Major General Mark Simerly. Also, Colonel Andy Morgado, the Director of the School of Advanced Military Studies, or SAMS, here at Fort Leavenworth. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Wyatt.
So normally we discuss an overview of the doctrine itself before we kind of get into the nuance and different subject matters of each one. So I'll go into that. So Reconstitution is an operation that commanders plan and implement to restore units to a level of combat effectiveness that is commensurate with their mission requirements and the available resources that they have. It's not just personnel and equipment. It's abstract things like platoon sergeants will become platoon leaders become company commanders, and so on. The major elements of Reconstitution are the assessment, reorganization, and regeneration. We have immediate versus deliberate Reconstitution. Also, with major losses, you're probably going to see a RTF, a Reconstitution Task Force. And so for our audience out there, in the publication, you'll see a visual depiction of a tank company that just broke contact, and we see how it could kind of play out. So obviously in this situation, there are no perfect solutions to the problem set. But first, I'll hit reorganization, because I think we as a force have some experience with that. You have immediate reorganization and you have deliberate. The best way to categorize these are to describe immediate as probably being done on the objective, while deliberate is done out of contact. Then we have regeneration, which can be broken down into two types of regeneration: incremental or subunit replacements. And here's a scenario with the different types of replacements and the merits and drawbacks a commander may notice while doing this. So you have Alpha Company loses 4 out of their 14 tanks in an engagement. 2 were lost from the first platoon, and the second and third platoon both lose 1. Under incremental regeneration, Alpha Company would receive their 4 replacement tanks with crews and ammo. The replacements would go to the appropriate platoons that experienced the loss, and then those new crews would then integrate themselves. Under subunit regeneration, Alpha Company would consolidate its remaining tanks into 2 platoons and then receive a completely new platoon. You got new PL, new platoon sergeant, everybody. This new platoon will have been conducting collective training as a platoon already. So the merits of incremental regeneration are that we maintain combat experience in each platoon, and the platoon leadership is familiar with the chain of command. But the drawbacks of incremental regeneration are that some crews are in new roles and there's some degree of training for them and for the new people coming in. The merits of subunit regeneration, the one where you get an entirely new platoon, are that the members of the consolidated platoon already know each other, and the new platoon requires less collective training. They probably have to learn some company SOPs, but they're well meshed with each other. But the drawbacks of this subunit regeneration are that the new platoons now have to integrate themselves with the entire chain of command, and they may lack combat experience. So there's clearly some hard choices in front of the commander at this point. So, sir, I'd like to bring you in and hear your take on this process, because though Reconstitution is not a sustainment operation, sustainment formations play a pivotal role. And you've had some previous positions in organizations that would play a key role in this. You were the commanding general of the 19th Expeditionary Sustainment Command, headquartered in Daegu, South Korea. And then from there, you moved up to Camp Humphreys to be the Assistant Chief of Staff, J4 for United States Forces Korea. But, sir, before we get to Reconstitution, can you describe for the audience members not in the sustainment community what is an Expeditionary Sustainment Command?
Wyatt, thanks. And I'll tell you, before I answer that specific question, this concept and the responsibilities of Reconstitution are something that I've had to address and understand and described to others really throughout my career. I remember the first exercise I did at the Corps level when I was tasked to support a Corps Rear CP and a warfighter exercise was to develop a plan for something called weapon system replacement operations. And so that was all the way back in 1992. And so I've been dealing with this question for some time, and I think there's a lot of leaders who've had challenges associated with it. And it may not come with the title of Reconstitution in a phase, but the objects and the outcomes of the operation are something that many people have experience with, and most leaders should have experience with. So I'll just start off with that. And then to your question, what is an ESC, an Expeditionary Sustainment Command? Well, it's a one-star logistics command that provides mission command for attached units in an area of operations, usually defined by a theater sustainment command, which it could work for, an R4, or a joint task force. And typically you'll see an ESC serving in a role providing sustainment for a corps or an Army headquarters like 8th Army in Korea, but also serving under a theater sustainment command doing roles such as theater opening, RSOI-like tasks, theater sustainment, theater distribution, etc. In the active component, we have 4 ESCs, and they're directly aligned either with Corps headquarters or with 8th Army headquarters, as an example. And so, what it is intended to do is to plan and execute sustainment, distribution, theater opening, reception, staging, and onward movement for Army forces. And depending upon the command structure within the theater, they might be employed to support specific Army forces within a specific area of operations or joint area of operations to support other ESCs or sustainment brigades with theater opening or theater distribution capabilities. And it's focused on synchronizing within the operational level of sustainment operations. And that helps the commander of that area of operations to meet their day-to-day tasks. And so the readiness and the operational requirements of the joint task force or the supported force is what an ESC addresses. And it provides the mid-range and short-range planning horizons based upon the JTF-O plan, the commander's intent, the CCAR, operational tempo, and of course distribution system capability. So I'll go back to where I began and say this is the sustainment command that supports either the Corps or the Army or a TSC.
Thanks, sir.
Sir, as an armor officer, I must say I'm a little disappointed that when you discussed weapon system replacement operations, you didn't use what an armor officer would call it, or WISRO, because we just like using that term because we can in a professional discussion. But to talk about my naivete as a young officer dealing with WISRO, we thought all you do is hit the WISRO button and a tank with 4 crewmen would miraculously appear to replace a lost tank. But I'm glad you used it, sir.
And Andy, like you, that's one of my favorite all-time acronyms in the Army, WISRO. And that's what I've encountered many times. A commander or a leader thinks this is something that somebody else is going to do for them to produce a combat capability to reconstitute or regenerate some combat power that's been degraded over time. And we have had plans in the past to do that, but they are resourced at a very high level, Corps level and above, in order to do something like that. And the complexity and the resources required aren't really anything that we envision right now to be done. So, for instance, behind a WISRO operation, weapon system replacement operation.
There you go, sir. That was good.
We had an entire inventory of materiel that was dedicated to do that in Europe, and storage sites and capabilities we used to call POMCA stocks. And forgive me if I don't give you the spell out of that acronym. But that's where we would have the tanks, all the other material that we could draw from those stocks and then issue for follow-on purposes as we reconstituted. Today, the stocks that we have pre-positioned in our Army pre-positioned stocks, we issue to arriving forces. So we don't have that inventory. So that's why I think WISRO, one reason why it's a dated term and dated operation.
Yes, sir. And, you being the former chief of staff, and I haven't said this yet, but being the former chief of staff of the 8th Army, you can attest to 19th ESC's role in that theater, can't you?
Oh, yes, sir. Certainly from an 8th Army perspective, 19th ESC punched way above its weight class in terms of what was, physically on the ground and having to leverage a multitude of sources within theater to generate, combat power and sustainment. So I guess not every ESC is built the same, and I think that's one of the challenges too in our Army is understanding that it's very much tailored to a specific theater. But one of the big tasks I know of 19th ESC with other sustainment partners was maintaining APS on the theater, though not directly the ESC's job, certainly a big part of it. And that's one of the big myths about Reconstitution is that we're going to pull from APS. Now, APS is already spoken for, and particularly in Korea, where we kind of have the fighting methodology. Hey, you're going to be alone for 30 days, right? So, what do you do with what you have on hand? And APS is already spoken for. So, another interesting Koreaism or understanding that.
Well, I think you make a good point, Andy, about the ESCs not all being the same. So, while each MTO ESC is identical, if you were to take a comparison between a CONUS-based ESC, like say, the 13th ESC stationed at Fort Hood that operates in support of 3 Corps, it has significantly less capability than the 19th ESC in Korea through our arrangements and host nation support. So, for instance, in the Distribution Management Center, there's a multitude of Korean teammates in either in the Korean Service Corps or another part of the workforce that provides some of that capability. So there's a lot of depth to that organization. And of course, it can tap into not just APS, it can tap into the host nation support network that's very mature and robust, and as you know, something that we exercise routinely for operation of nodes and modes and routes, all required to support not only RSOI, but theater sustainment.
It is definitely a unique environment. I mean, when you talk about doctrine, it's almost as if you were going to talk about doctrine and then you were talking about Korea. You have to, we should always be changing our mindset about the operational environment, but for those who had been in the ROC, you understand. So I've already kind of talked about what Reconstitution looks like, specifically a regeneration scenario, with the replacement tanks showing up to an attrited unit as an example, but those replacements came from somewhere. And the personnel and the equipment, it all came from somewhere and was brought in some sort of fashion or some sort of way by a sustainment formation. So in general, sir, and you mentioned IMTO issues and it would be different, or the IMTOs are the same, but how would an ESC play a role in Reconstitution, depending on the type of units at the time underneath that guidon?
Well, I think if let's say we were to take a division following something like a wet gap crossing, right? So probably transitioning to the defense or maybe a follow-on mission that would come. But after the completion of a forward passage of lines, doing a wet gap crossing, that organization has had its combat power attrited. So what are the phased approaches to reconstitution for that organization? So first of all, you're going to start with reorganization. That's really phase one of reconstitution. And within that, there's going to be some things that the unit can do organically. For instance, it can do all of its combat replenishment, right? So there might be some requirement for stocks that are not currently within the division, but for the most part, you're going to be able to replenish the fuel, the munitions, those other things to restore them to their basic load. So that's a way to help improve combat power. And of course, then there's the maintenance actions where you can do those things, maybe BDAR, battle damage assessment and repair, cannibalization, cross-leveling of parts and equipment to generate higher readiness levels in terms of your operational readiness rate. So those are all components of reorganization, in addition to cross-leveling of personnel and equipment. So, a commander may decide I need to get a unit up to a certain level of readiness, and they're going to prioritize formations within that division or within a brigade. So those are really the initial steps into it. And those are things mostly that a unit can do organically with its assigned capability or with those that are operating in direct support. I think where the ESC comes in, although there could be some direction of traffic and prioritization of materiel delivery within that first phase, but it's really within the second phase, which is the regeneration. Regeneration intentional restoration of a unit's combat power, right? And it's a very deliberate approach. Generally, it has to take place somewhere that is not impeded by the threat, or where the threat can be mitigated. So you can apply resources and conduct the operation in a way that allows the unit to achieve its regeneration objectives. So usually it's generated from a corps level or above. In a committed division, it really can't regenerate a subordinate unit. It's going to need help from beyond that division level. And even if it is not committed division, we'll need significant help from an ESC or a TSC. And you can think of some of the things from a distribution standpoint, a supply standpoint, material management standpoint, life support standpoint, and even contracting that would be required to execute a mission like this. And I'll go back and I said a mission. This is an operation, right? I think we all acknowledge that, and I'm sure as Mr. Creed describes it, it's really clear that this is not something that a sustainment organization does without other warfighting functions helping to enable it as well.
And one thing that you mentioned, sir, that stuck out to me, we have to find a place to do this reconstitution that's kind of out of contact, or at least the threat is diminished. But then I think about the newly published FM 3.0 and the imperatives of always being under observation and usually in constant contact. I mean, that has to be a really tough ticket to figure out, correct?
No, it really is. And, it depends on the battlefield, of course, and, the circumstances of the threat. But if you think about some of the actions that I just described, personnel and equipment restoration, health service support, collective training, even, those are all tasks that are not executed well when a unit's in contact, right? I think we all know that. So you really have to take an organization offline, let's just say that, in order to do this effectively, or in a deliberate manner. So that really leads me to discuss this next point is there must be a contingency plan for this, right? It's not something that you want to develop after you've conducted the wet gap crossing. You want to have this plan, and you want to have rehearsed this plan. You want to ensure that all the stakeholders, all the responsible commands are aware of their roles and have identified the resources that are be necessary in order to do that. You don't want discovery learning after the fact and hope that you're going to achieve your objectives. So that's often a neglected portion of this, is to understand the planning that's necessary to this in advance in order to execute it.
You talked. Go ahead, sir.
Sorry, in your previous statement and Wyatt's question, kind of go to it, but I want to focus on the word you used was prioritization, right? And I think that word really highlights why this is an operational problem and not a logistics or sustainment problem, because it's going to be that unit commander, whether division, brigade, battalion level, that has to make some very clear decisions about what he or she wants in order to continue the operation. So, our logistician superheroes are going to keep hauling stuff to the front and moving broke stuff to the rear as they see it. But unless the commander clearly articulates, okay, I need to regenerate my reconnaissance in order to push them forward, okay, that's then a clear priority for reconstitution. We got to get reconnaissance done first, and then other things can wait. So that just really highlights this idea of this is an operation run by the commander of the organization, not a subtask that you delegate to your logistics commander, because he or she is not going to know what to do first if we don't prioritize that for him.
I think also defining the objective of the reconstitution. So, and doing that in advance. We will never be able to predict the degradation of combat power following any operation, right? But we can make informed estimates, and we can determine, whether or not we need to get to a 75% or an 85% mark in combat power in that unit as we reconstitute it, or if it's necessary, 100%, so we've got an operational unit that can be employed for all of its intended purposes. But I think that estimation and setting that objective up front is really important to this. And that's in part because you have to task organize for this effort, right? You're not really going to be able to take any standing organization in order to execute this. And what we see as a technique is the establishment of a task force. And it's a Reconstitution task force. And if you look at what it does, providing the equipment repair, replacement, supply replenishment, all those commodities, the fuel, the ammo, et cetera, the mission essential training, right? So that is really, you talk about the training aspect, and it really highlights the fact that you can't take a single functional type command to do this, right? This is a multifunctional effort. It has to be a multifunctional team if you're going to dedicate it to that. So, for instance, a division commander anticipating this can create a demand signal for another organization outside the division to oversee that collective training in advance if it's planned adequately, and that's going to help to assure its success. But I think it's really important to understand that RTF, the Reconstitution Task Force, is a really well proven and well understood technique for success.
Yes, sir. And we kind of hit this about planning this in advance, right? So this goes, this is something that somebody in the G5 is going to be working on, probably putting it in the O plan, reviewing it in conjunction with the G4, probably, writing those branches, writing those sequels. And you mentioned the wet gap crossing. That's already part of the wet gap crossing process, is what are we going to do once we get to the far side? And then you have to plan for that two-way traffic. Like you said, bring the casualties and the broken equipment back. But Colonel Morgado, sir, so right now you're the director of SAMS. And I said before this, you were the 8th Army Chief of Staff, also at Camp Humphreys. But when you were a student at SAMS, your monograph was on Reconstitution. And you really hit some of the issues that we face at a national level, because Reconstitution, it's an operational problem, but it can go all the way up to the national level. So I was really interested in your monograph, and when you were talking about force structure issues, at the time of your writing, we had removed the major commitments in Iraq. We were drawing down in Afghanistan, and you pull from some authors, and I'll let you kind of go into that. But can you kind of orient the audience a little bit about what you learned with Reconstitution while you wrote your monograph? Sure.
I guess the first thing I have to say is that no good deed goes unpunished. So I wrote a monograph to meet an educational requirement, and here I am talking about it, 7 years later.
That's right.
But it's good. It's all good because it's all good Army business. So I think you're referring to the Kagan and Donnelly model that I use about blocks, but I can't talk about them until I talk about Richard Betts first, who's a theorist. Spent a lot of time talking about surprise and about readiness. So Richard Betts talks about there's three kinds of readiness. There's structural, operational, and mobilization. The sexy topic is all about operational readiness because, whether it be civilian leadership, Congress, even senior military leaders want to know about, how many divisions and brigades can you generate. But I think the true professional, particularly at the strategic level and at the operational level, needs to understand structural and mobilization. So, Richard Betts talks about we have to define readiness in terms of for when, for what, and of what, right? So, again, we need to focus not so much on the operational, but on structural mobilization, meaning what does our force need to look like, and then how do we mobilize to that force? Because we know in a large-scale combat operation, whatever our current standing active duty forces isn't going to be enough to accomplish what some of our anticipated missions are. So we use .mil-PF, right? Doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, personnel, and facilities. So understanding structurally, what do we want to do? It all starts with the D, with doctrine, right? So what is it? How is it that our organization is going to fight? And then everything else that follows in .mil-PF has to follow doctrine. It's how we're going to build our units and our organizations. So once we get the doctrine figured out, and now we know it's an MDO, right? And large-scale combat operations in terms of how we're developing, how we're going to fight, and then what elements are going to help us to do that. So what Kagan and his co-author Donnelly suggested for organization, and again, this is back in the 2014 range, said, hey, we just need a force that can do these 6 different missions, right? We want one for coin, we want a force that can handle 2 simultaneous campaigns. We need a partner force. We need a counterproliferation force. We need a strategic reserve, and we need an institutional base. So as I reflect on now and my research, it was total crap.
Really?
I would not go back, and I would not advocate for Kagan. So because perhaps I was a little naive and I was looking at the world a little bit differently, but I would not support the Kagan 6-block model. However, what I do support is we do have to figure out what our organization is going to look like, and then what our ease is of producing that organization, and then we can build the right material and get the right training done for our organization. So that's important. We've got to figure that out. That is an important step. It's not just publishing our keystone document. FM30 is real important, but what comes after that? And the key is it has to do with our industrial base. If we know what kind of force that we're going to fight, then that alerts our sustainment teams and, more importantly, our industrial base, what type of equipment that they have to build and what kind of quantities. So that part, logical, makes sense. I'll stand by it. Using the Kagan-Donnelly model, I made a big mistake. That's not what I would advocate for. But anyway, so that if that answers your question.
It does, sir. And I mean, when you mentioned the industrial base and, in large-scale combat operations, Reconstitution effort's going to call on that industrial base. And before he retired, sir, word around the campfire was that General Perna was very involved in developing and working with the industrial base. So how is that? What are the key organizations that are going to play into the industrial base? I think there's some that those in the operational Army may not really understand these type of units that exist out there. Can you go into that, sir?
Well, you mentioned General Perna, of course, in his role as the commander of the Army Materiel Command, which has direct responsibility for a large component of the nation's and all of the Army's defense industrial base. So that the depots that produce munitions, they produce and repair equipment, that's all part of the OIB, the Organic Industrial Base. And you'll see in the coming years a tremendous reinvestment in those capabilities because there's a modernization requirement there, but also there's a workforce retention and development requirement that's all tied in a vision by AMC and their current plan to modernize the OIB. I would say also the defense industrial base is broader than that, though. And you have to understand that there's components of access to commercial markets. So you look at all the services, the demand that stimulates production, and it includes many commercial markets. So, for instance, with Defense Logistics Agency, they own the medical supply chain that supports the DoD. So all of the Class 8, all of the other pharmaceuticals that the DoD and the Army requires are generated from commercial stocks. And so having access to those markets at critical times, like during a pandemic, are challenges, or to stimulate production of things like vaccines or other items that we might need for protection of soldiers in conflict, usually competes with a commercial market as well. So there's ways that we can gain access to a market with investments up front. So for instance, DLA will partner with some commercial providers to have a percentage of a market for a commodity during a contingency by paying them continuously up front. It's like insurance. So those are some ways that we look at the industrial base widely beyond just the things that the Army owns that it can invest in directly. But I think it's really important, what Andy was talking about, and I'll just, I love giving credit to Rich Creed and his team, especially when it comes to 3.0, and I think it's brilliant in so many ways, but one of the ways it's really important that we understand is it created a fourth level of war. Now, it's not true that it created it. It actually just labeled it and helped us understand it. So obviously the tactical and the operational, right? But then the theater strategic and the national strategic. So, the operation we're talking about now with a Reconstitution, with an ESC as an example, or could even be a theater sustainment command, operational and tactical. However, it relies upon capabilities that are strategic. And for instance, Army preposition stocks in a theater of operations as an example, strategic capability, but it may be a theater-specific capability that's strategic. And so now that we have this delineation, it's really helpful as we align roles, responsibilities, and resources. Or if it's national strategic, like something in the organic industrial base or the defense industrial base. So I think that's really helpful in helping us understand the problem set, but also where the resourcing and where unit responsibilities can lie.
And so just a caveat off of that. So when I talked about, Betts' operational mobilization and structural readiness, under mobilization, people should not equate it with just mobilizing people. It also means how we mobilize the industrial base, because we have to send some sort of demand signal back of what we need, and then how do we, rebuild some capabilities that may have, gone away. And so that mobilization piece is all encompassing, and so absolutely the understanding that theater and national link up, and how it ties into the operational, all the way down to how that tank platoon is going to get its tank is all important. It's all one string.
Yeah, I think sometimes people, at least in my generation of service members, may not fully grasp or appreciate the importance of Reconstitution, because doing it at the scale that we might need to do in large-scale combat operations, we haven't done it really since, maybe World War II, maybe Vietnam. But do you guys, in your careers, have we done anything? Can you recall of any event? You mentioned something, sir, early on in your career that you were focused with equipment replacement. Do you have any experience with doing this? There's a few times in Afghanistan we kind of replaced some battalions, but...
Well, I think we had very mature plans that we rehearsed to a certain level of fidelity in the Cold War of Europe, right? So during that time, we went down to the point where we were loading trains with materiel. We were bringing them forward to certain locations, linking them up with units, as we looked at weapon system replacement operations. So we do have fairly recent experience with that. And I would say, we did experience combat losses, let's say the early stages, an initial phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom, as an example, right? As approach into Baghdad. We had to restore combat power to those units for them to be able to continue on their mission. And we didn't take them out of contact in order to do that. So I don't think anybody would say this was a deliberate regeneration, but certainly there was reorganization that took place in the near term. And then there were non-organic capabilities that were beyond the division level that were applied in order to do that. So I think if you were to talk to commanders in those formations, they experienced something like Reconstitution.
Well, I have no, real world application, and I would agree with General Simerly. I think much of what we've done has been well below the threshold of a reconstitution, more reorganization, and resupply. But I do have an example. As a captain, this was 1999. I was the S4 for 4th Squadron, 7th Cavalry. Back in Korea, we were in a warfighter exercise. And so we deployed, obviously the main, tactical operations center and the combat trains command post, which I was the leader of. And so our squadron was assigned the mission of conducting a zone recon that then turned into a hasty attack, and we fought through the night. And so, being an armor officer in the CTCP, I was all about, being in a knife fight. We're doing CASEVAC, we're doing vehicle evacuation, we're doing emergency resupply of, 3-5, and just all through the night. We were doing an all-nighter. And so finally, we reached, the limit of advance of our attack. It was successful. We were victorious. We're doing the victory dance on the objective. And so I blow out of CTCP, and I'm headed to the sleep tent. It's about for me to go 10 toes up. And who did I see leaving the TOC but my squadron commander, then Lieutenant Colonel Mike Formica, right? And he's leaving the CP, and I'm about to give him a high five, like how well we did. And he looks at me and he's like, "Where the hell are you going?" Right? And so I'm like, "Oh man." I go, "Sir, what are you talking about?" He's like, I go, "You're the 4. Your fight's just starting. We got to reconstitute all our elements. We took we won, but we took a pretty big lick. You need to get back in the CTCP and start figuring out how we regenerate." And so my big poopy face came on. I said, "Yes, sir." I did an about face back in the CTCP, and I went into assessment, reorganization, regeneration activity. So even then, 99, we were training it. I just don't think we've done it to that level as General Simerly noted, but we certainly have thought about it and applied it at different times.
And kudos to Mike Formica for realizing that and applying focus and guidance to that end. It's a challenge that we typically have in the training environment, right? The limits of the training environment, the number of training days we have, the training objectives that we have to get after, where we don't necessarily get the opportunity to service that training objective, whether it's at a CTC or whether it's at a warfighter exercise at division or corps level. It's usually something that's left on the table that we know we must do, but we don't do.
Yes, sir. Since you brought up training, sir, I'm thinking about all these warfighters that we have, and we do the sexy stuff and those and C2ing. That's a bad word, but we C2 the wet gap crossing, and then sometimes they give the nice hand wave for reconstitution. Right now, do you think we have the training infrastructure in place anywhere to be able to actually do a physical reconstitution exercise like you mentioned back in the Cold War days?
So I mean, there's no doubt that we have the infrastructure, we have the capability, but do we have the time? Versus all the other training objectives that we have to get after is probably the question. And I certainly understand and support commanders who see other training priorities that they have. But we used to say that about things like RSO and I as well, right? Where we didn't rehearse those, where we didn't plan them adequately, and we didn't get a chance to focus on them. So if you've had the benefit of being in an organization, like I was when I was in 8th Army, where you had commanders focus, or U.S. Forces Korea, where they knew the importance of that operation, and it was something that we rehearsed twice a year, every year. And not only rehearsed it in terms of a deliberate rehearsal where you bring all the commanders together, but rehearsed it on the ground, where we're actually bringing in combat power, integrating it with the host nation support activities, doing all the reception, staging onward movement, and integration. Now, did we ever really get to the level of detail that we would need to in order to really execute it? No, not quite, especially when it came to integration. Rarely did we really lay out, or I would say never in my time, did we lay out the tactical assembly areas. We'd want to bring in units, match them with all of their basic loads and the training, in order to get them fully integrated. But we knew what the requirements were, and we rock drilled those. So I would argue that there's going to be a day when we need to do a deliberate approach, have a deliberate training approach to this process if we expect to be able to regenerate combat power. I would not want to have an operation underway against either our acute threat in Europe or our pacing threat in the Pacific, winging this process in order to regenerate combat power or reconstitute combat power, because there's nobody else who's going to come and do it for us, right? There's nobody who's lurking in the background who's going to come in and save the day. It's on us, and the responsibilities to generate the combat power and anticipate the degradation and all the resources are going to be required to do that are incumbent upon us today.
Are there some misconceptions? We mentioned a few. One, like, this is a sustainment operation. No, it's not. It's an operation with sustainment elements to it. APS, you already said APS is spoken for. What are some other, and I'll throw this out to both of you, what are some misconceptions that we get?
I would say from an operator, I think one of the misconceptions that we have is that we're going to get the same exact gear that we lost, right? I would say that in our current environment, with some of the absolutely exquisite capability that's turned out and we field, when we lose it, it's going to take a little bit to make another one just like it. So we have to expect that we might receive gear in replacement that's 1 or 2 generations older than the equipment that just blew up underneath us, right? And so that's going to involve some training aspect. I mean, you might have to do training for your crews to go on the Mark I version as opposed to the Mark IV version that he or she has been operating. So we got to think through that. Also, since reconstitution is not just about equipment, think about MOSs, right? So you're I don't know, 35 Fox, or, you might not get a 35 Fox. You might have to train God help you, a 19 kilo, right? And I'm a 19 series, so I can say that, to do that job. So it's going to take time, energy and resources to return that capability back. So don't expect you're going to get a like item in reply. So I think that's a huge misconception that we got to knock down.
Sir?
Yeah, I think there's a few points that are real important to consider here. And I really like where Andy just went with his discussion about the personnel implications of this as well. So from a planning perspective, something that we don't do as well as we should is estimate our future personnel requirements for replacement operations. And that casualty estimate, right, that is done as part of the sustainment cell, as part of any battle staff, right, is so important. And commanders have to demand a quality, validated casualty estimate going into the fight, so that you can contemplate and you can start to consider what it's the magnitude of the replacement operations required to help to regenerate your combat power. There's a new tool that we're using now called the Medical Planner's Toolkit, and it provides a 10x level of fidelity on casualty estimation than we've had in the past, and it's already being used in many different training environments. But I encourage commanders to focus on that casualty estimate to help drive planning considerations for reconstitution. I'd say there's a couple other aspects of this. We talked about the necessity of training and integration into our training exercises, accounting for it. But also there's, I think, a recognition that, yes, as we've talked about, reconstitution, a deliberate two-phase process with reorganization and regeneration, but we replenish combat power continuously, right? And the extent that we're successful in doing that during operations and setting conditions for that prior to operations will help to guard against the scale of regeneration we have to do following operations. So the things that we can do in terms of positioning of our assets, integration of capabilities into our march columns, think about the wet gap crossing again, the science of movement, and ensuring that we understand how to integrate capabilities so that when we get to the far side of an obstacle, we can have the endurance that we require not only to complete our missions, but to be postured for the next missions. And so, the level of fidelity that we apply to those operations will mitigate the scale or scope of the regeneration constitutions after operations as well.
Yes, sir. So I have one more question before I give you guys the last word. Let's say you're back at Chief of Staff of 8th Army, sir, and you're back either J4 or the 19th ESC commander, and you have a new staff coming in, and we have to do some reconstitution. What do you say to your staff? I'll start with you, Colonel Morgado.
Sure. Yeah. So, 8th Army, being a unique entity, right? It's the only field army within our inventory. So having some operational requirements, and on top of that, having, theater Army-like responsibilities. So, a couple different hats. I would say, the first thing I'd tell the staff is we got to think 2 levels down. And what does that mean, right? So having the 19th ESC as a subordinate command, 8th Army and 2nd Infantry Division, those are 2 general officer commands. So we got to think at brigade level for them. However, we have all the supporting brigades, like 35th ADA and other brigades. So we have to think down to the battalion level for those, particularly with some of the very unique capabilities that they bring. So as you think about reconstitution, you got to think down to that level, which may not be where a 8th Army planner or staff officer would immediately have to go to, because we're thinking at a different echelon. Then I'd also say we have to think 2 levels up, if not higher. Because our job as 8th Army staff would have to be to articulate to USRPAC, to USFK, to AMC, and other support entities, what is it exactly that we need, right? And we have to articulate in a way that they can understand and then package it properly for us, so then we can take it, integrate it on the peninsula, using 19th ESC, I'm sure, and then getting it down to the user level. Then the last thing I would say is you got to think about our ROC partners. Because we are in Korea, we are joined at the hip We cannot accomplish that mission on the peninsula unless we're working very closely together. And based upon the nature and the intensity of the conflict that we would expect to have on the peninsula, we're going to take some serious losses. Even if we're very, very successful, we're going to experience a lot of losses. And our ROC partners, based upon the current O plan and how we expect to fight, are going to take the brunt of that. And so they're going to come to us for help without question. They're going to come ask us for help. So what do we have in our inventory that we can share with them, and how much can we afford to share? So I would say those would be the three big things I think I would communicate to the 8th Army staff.
Yeah. And you use the ROC as an example, sir, because we're all coming from ROC, but this would apply to Europe. So your partner, so our European forces, they could be Polish, they could be whatever it is, like they'd be taking the brunt of something. So it would be working with that. So General Simerly, what would be your message to the staff or your staff?
I really appreciate Andy's viewpoint in terms of focus 2 levels down and 2 levels up. And I would say on that, 2 levels up, to express a clear demand signal in advance to the strategic enablers, both at the theater and the national levels, for future requirements. Register demand upon the Joint Logistics Enterprise. Not only those providing materiel, but also those providing transport of that materiel. So it's registered. If we're really mature about this, these requirements are probably on a tip fid somewhere, right? Not something that's a contingency stock that we might need later on. We know we're going to need it at some phase of the battle, these capabilities. I also like Andy's point about the gear that we end up with, right? Probably not being identical to what we had at the beginning of the fight. So it's going to introduce an interoperability gap that we have to account for. And it might be, a pretty simple example would be our communications equipment. But there's many other aspects to it that we have to account for in our training plan. And then going back to the host nation support aspect, yes, I think we can anticipate demands from them. Okay, we know about precision munitions as an example, right? But also they may have resources that we can coordinate in advance, especially if you're talking about node and mode operators that could help us to do this, or coordinating for terrain or routes would help us to enable this at particular phases, and deconflicting requirements for those things with the host nation, all really important. But also I would just say some senior level considerations, right? It's just kind of a checklist of things that you probably want to bring into this effort analytically. So being able to assess the desired level of capability that's needed based upon the situation and anticipated follow-on operations for that degraded unit. Being able to assess the intensity, nature, and duration of the battle, assess the overall condition of the unit to be reconstituted, and having the right tools that allow you to do that without guessing. Looking at the availability of replacement personnel and equipment, so you really understand what's in the inventory, what's in the art of possible from the training base, or cross-leveling from other units that may not be in the theater of operations. As I mentioned before, anticipating the location of these regeneration sites, because you probably don't want to do that in the woods, right? Or on soft ground. You probably want to have a place, that has some level of maturity, probably some components like power and some other things like that to help you do this. And then, we talked about it before. What are the enemy capabilities? Where is he going to be able to range you where you're doing this? How far back? How many terrain features away do you have to transport this or do it, with a unit? So that's another consideration. And then thinking about the availability of transportation assets, right? So at any given point in time, there's going to be a high demand on transportation assets. And so how you allocate this, how you prioritize it, how as we talk about transportation, prioritizing not only forward but also rearward movement, but also prioritizing the transportation assets as well is another consideration. And then just, the time available and the level that you need to achieve in terms of the readiness will help you, gauge your level of effort and resources you put against it. And I would say that in any given theater, we'll do this more than one time, right? So what do you do to improve and set conditions for those follow-on times. Can you afford to hold some capability in reserve? Unlike artillery systems, we do hold sustainment capabilities in reserve typically. Do you want to preserve some future combat power generation capability by only getting a given unit up to, say, 70%, so you can spread more of that peanut butter later on? And then how do you turn that into a long-term demand signal to solve the future problem?
Definitely a complicated issue. So, gentlemen, before I let you go, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we take off?
Hey, no, thanks for the opportunity. I'm a big fan of the Breaking Doctrine podcast series, and now I feel very fortunate to be part of its inventory.
Thank you, sir. Thank you both, sir.
No, thanks a lot, Wyatt. Awesome.
All right. Put this podcast together. It took a whole team of people. We've kind of been working on this for a while, so just want to kind of give a quick shout out to Lieutenant Colonel retired John Cullen, who did a lot of work on developing the outline for this, and then obviously, sir, your staff out at Fort Lee, the CASCOM staff really supported the whole process. So I just want to give a shout out to all of them and convey our thanks for all the help that they did. Obviously, the fact that you came out here, sir, I appreciate it. Colonel Morgado, really appreciate you coming over. I'd also like to thank our listeners and know that the views and opinions expressed in the podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, the Combined Arms Center, and the U.S. Army.